Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. It's time for our weekly monk chat session. So your opportunity to ask questions about Buddhism. And as long as questions appear, I will answer them until we either run out of time or run out of questions. So whenever you're ready, you can start typing in questions to the comments window. And assuming some questions appear in the next half a minute or so, then I'll start responding to them. So first I'll begin with paying homage to the Buddha, and then after that I'll answer whatever questions are there. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So hello to all the people checking in online. Hello to Aparna, Jerry, John, Maria, Olga, Bhumika, Kumu, Karuna, Luisa, and Hasanta, and Gregory. Good to see all of you joining in. What I don't see is any questions, which may make for a very short and boring monk chat. So if anybody wants to have monk chat, this is your chance. There are a few people this morning during the sutta study who asked some off-topic questions. This would be a great chance to bring up those questions. Here's one. So Aparna says, how to investigate cause of a blurry, not so sharp mind? Thinking seems to result in more. Or more blurriness, I assume you mean. Well, thinking seems to result in more tiredness, and it's like they're still going. Well, just to start with this, the main way to investigate the cause is to start trying to apply suitable solutions and see what works. And that will give you a sense as to what the cause is. So blurry mind, sometimes it's actually very simply caused by not sleeping enough. So making sure that you're sleeping sufficiently. Sometimes it's caused by the opposite, by oversleeping, spending too much time lazing about in bed. That can also cause a blurry mind. So if we've ruled out those two, so undersleeping and oversleeping, if you think you're sleeping the proper amount, then some other things to investigate are you actually interested in your meditation practice? Like whatever method you're using, whatever meditation technique or meditation object you're using, are you actually interested? Often blurry mind during meditation is a symptom of being uninterested in the meditation method that you're using. In which case, the solution is to do something different. So use a different meditation method. Try something new. Or try a new way of approaching the meditation object you're currently using, a different way of practicing meditation with it. So that can also make a big difference. So if you are switching objects and you're still having blurry mind, there's also a number of usual suggestions which are generally applicable. One is to sit up straight, meditate with your eyes half open. Those are both things that help a lot. Have a bit of tea before meditation. That also can help quite a bit, so not to be dismissed. Those are the most common. Sometimes it's related to what we've been doing during our day-to-day activities. If there's been something which we really don't want to face or don't want to deal with, then again, sometimes we try to escape it by blanking out. So that's also something to consider that maybe there's something going on in your life which you're not willing to confront. So the way we face that actually is by cultivating the willingness to look at whatever is going on in our mind, the willingness to be present with whatever is flowing through the mind. So when the mind is not aversive towards any of the objects that are flowing through the mind, then those objects will not disturb us or bother us. So then that then means that the mind will be more present with the meditation. And Mir says, I'm curious which text I can start reading to learn or study the basics of Buddhism as a newcomer. Well, one book I have commonly recommended in the past is called The Noble Eightfold Path by Bhikkhu Bodhi. So that's a pretty solid introduction to Buddhism. Another quite good one, it's relatively old, but still pretty good, is called What the Buddha Taught by Venerable Walpola Rahula. That one's also quite good. And if you want to get started with reading the Buddha's own words, then I recommend the anthology In the Buddha's Words by Bhikkhu Bodhi, translated by Bhikkhu Bodhi. It's the collection of discourses from the Buddha. So those are three that I can recommend: the Noble Eightfold Path, What the Buddha Taught, and In the Buddha's Words. Those three books are a pretty good starting point. Then we have a question from Kumu. Kumu says, if we are not doing breath meditation, what is the best way to start our meditation session? I have this notion that we have to at least follow the breath and relax and then move on. Well, if that works for you, then you can do that. Like if something's working, you don't need to stop. So if it helps you to start with a couple of minutes of breath meditation, then start with a couple of minutes of breath meditation. That's totally fine. It's just not required. It's not obligatory. You can start with whatever meditation object you want to start with. But if you find it works for you to start with doing a bit of breath meditation before doing other things, then that's fine. You can do that. And Demsim says, can speak about having too much desire to deepen one's meditation practice, resulting in putting extra effort while sitting, referring to Buddha's quail simile. There are multiple quail similes in the sutta, so you need to specify which one you're referring to. Too much desire to deepen one's meditation practice. I'm not sure there's such a thing as too much desire to deepen one's meditation practice. We want to be enthusiastic about our practice. It's usually the problem is when we're not sufficiently enthusiastic about our practice. That's when we get lazy. So it's actually good to be enthusiastic about your practice, and it is good to put forth an appropriate amount of effort. Otherwise, you wind up just sitting there and spacing out and wasting time and not really getting anywhere. And Colin says, how to distinguish between a feeling of depression and nibbida. I feel disappointed and seem to not be interested anymore in the material world. So the difference is that nibbida has a feeling of contentment and serenity. So the mind is completely happy with not needing anything at all. So nibbida means one is, literally it means to stop searching. So we've stopped searching for external sources of happiness. So this means contentment. The mind is completely content, completely happy with without needing anything outside of itself. So this is very different from depression. The state of nibbida is a state of serene bliss, serene joy, based upon contentment and freedom from desire. So again, much different from disappointment and depression. And Jefferson says, what is the most accurate translation of vitakka and vichara? Well, there's many debates on this topic, but I personally think that the words vitakka and vichara, their meaning is very straightforward and clear. So in the suttas, the words vitakka and vichara are used all throughout the suttas as ordinary words with ordinary meanings. So the word vitakka just means thought. And the word vichara means investigation or moving about or wandering. So in the context of meditation practice, I don't see any reason to interpret these words as meaning anything else than what they mean everywhere else in the suttas. And the Buddha himself doesn't give any reason to interpret them as meaning anything else. He doesn't define the words any differently. So it seems reasonable then to assume that when the Buddha is talking about meditation, vitakka also still just means thought, and vichara still just means movement, in this case, mental movement. So then vitakka and vichara, which are defined as the defects of first jhana, by the way. So we spoke a couple days ago on the Kantika Sutta, which was translated as thorn, but it can also mean defect or obstruction. So the defect of first jhana is that it still has vitakka and vichara. It still has some degree of thought and mental movement going on. It's quite subtle and mild, but it's still present. So the mind is not yet completely stable because it's still disturbed by a little bit of mental movement. So vitakka and vichara then is that those thoughts and mental movements which keep occurring in the background of the mind, even when the mind is very concentrated. And that persists during first jhana, but fades away as one moves into second jhana. So this is why second jhana then is characterized as having a much deeper bliss born from concentration and stillness, because that mental activity has finally stopped completely. And Jason says, what is the difference between consciousness and the six sense bases independent origination? So I assume you're referring to vijnana as the third stage of paticcasamuppada versus the six senses, which occur a little bit later. So avijja paccaya sankhara, sankhara paccaya vijnana, third stage. Vijnana paccaya namarupa, namarupa paccaya salayatana, which then is the fifth. So this also is a point of a lot of debate because vijnana in the suttas is most commonly defined as meaning the vijnana of the six senses, so awareness of the six senses. But in the context of paticcasamuppada, vijnana appears prior to the arising of body and mind, nama rupa, and prior, therefore, to the arising of the six senses. So in the context of paticcasamuppada, vijnana seems to be referring to something more primordial. So a consciousness which is not directly tied to the six senses. So again, there's different opinions and debates about why it's placed there and what that means. One way I've heard it explained, which makes a certain amount of sense to me, is it's talking about, so vijnana there is talking about the arising of self-awareness or self-consciousness. So the sense of me. So as a separate entity, as a separate being. But it's one step prior to identifying what it is that I think I am. So it starts always with avijja, with ignorance. So ignorance of the true nature of reality. And based upon that ignorance, there are sankharas. So sankharas meaning either separate objects, distinct phenomena, rather the appearance of distinct objects, or it means mental activities and processes. But at this stage, there's not yet the five khandhas. So it seems odd here that sankhara would mean specifically mental activities. So as the second stage of paticcasamuppada, it seems more likely it's talking about the delusion of there being separate, discrete phenomena. So based upon ignorance, then there comes the concept of separate, discrete objects. And then there is self-consciousness or self-awareness of I am one of these separate, distinct phenomena that's currently present. So what am I? Then we identify a body and mind, a nama rupa, and we say, oh, that's me. I am that body and mind. And what does that body and mind have? It has the six senses. Sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. The six senses, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. It's like, oh, okay. And there are sensations happening through those six senses. Those are my sensations. I like some of them and I dislike some of them. Oh, that's my Vedana. And so on. So it proceeds from there. So this is one way of explaining it, which I personally find quite convincing. And Kumu then says, with reference to Vitakka and Vichara, does this mean many advanced meditators can attain the first jhana fairly easily? Well, it all depends on what you mean by advanced meditator and what you mean by fairly easily. So if we define an advanced meditator as someone who can attain jhana fairly easily, then yes, I would agree with this statement. In the suttas, the Buddha actually says, when the Buddha is talking about advanced practitioners, this is actually one of the things he describes them as. He says it's someone who can, without difficulty, attain and remain in the first jhana. That's one of the ways the Buddha describes an advanced meditator, an advanced practitioner. So yeah, absolutely. That being said, how many advanced meditators are there in the world? Probably realistically not that many. Again, jhana is possible, but it depends upon living a lifestyle which is conducive to a silent, peaceful, alert mind. And most people are not living a lifestyle conducive to a silent, peaceful, and alert mind. Not even most monks are living a lifestyle which is really supportive to jhana practice. So you do need to actually structure your life in such a way that it supports samadhi. If you're living a crazy, hectic, complicated life, then it's very unlikely you're going to enter jhana anytime soon. Possibly not at all during this life. At least not until you simplify your life significantly. Next question here is again from Colin saying, related to Jefferson's question earlier, what was Jefferson's question? Vitakka and Vichara. Can you explain the difference between Vichara and Papancha? Okay, so again, Vichara by itself, the word Vichara means wandering or exploring. Whereas the word Papancha has the meaning of complication or proliferation. So the difference here I would make is that vichara is more like when your mind is just kind of wandering around a bit. So the mind is not completely still. It's still kind of drifting and wandering a little bit. Whereas papancha is when you're really into storytelling in your mind. Like you're really imagining and building up storylines and talking to yourself and formulating imagery, and you're really, really into constructing and building something in your mind. So vichara is just that kind of like drifting a little bit, whereas papancha is like full on fiction author overcharge mode. And Sud says, I was listening to a lecture from a Malaysian monk who stated there is stream entry and stream winning. Two are different. Was hoping to ask you to get some more clarity on this. What is the difference between stream entry and stream winning, and what does it really mean to enter the stream? And if it's practice of Eightfold Path, then how is it different from a confused person's practice of the Eightfold Path? I have no idea what that monk was talking about. So stream entry and stream winning are both common translations of the same word, which is sotapatti. So they're just two different translations of one word. It's not different words. It's the same word. So therefore, they can't possibly be different things. But it's possible that that monk meant something different, in which case you would have to ask him what he meant. What did he mean when he said that stream entry is one thing and stream winning is another? Maybe ask, what are the Pali words which he's using to define these two separate things? And how does he define these two separate things such that they are in fact separate things? Because in the suttas, there's only one word, sottapatti, and translators will translate it either as stream entry or stream winning or sometimes other things. But the Pali word is just sottapatti, and it refers to the moment when one attains the first stage of awakening. And yes, one gets to that point by practicing the Noble Eightfold Path. And Tandik says, does anatta mean it's okay to be snapped at, to be humiliated? So for an advanced Buddhist practitioner who has cultivated equanimity, then they will not be bothered when other people snap at them or try to humiliate them. They will not be hurt or offended or upset. However, that does not justify the attacker's behavior. The attacker is still engaging in unwholesome behavior. They're still cultivating bad karma. And the person who is being targeted, even if they themselves are not personally offended or bothered or upset, they may still call out the attacker. They may still criticize the attacker out of compassion in order to help the attacker recognize that their behavior is inappropriate and needs to be changed. But when one is well developed in one's practice, then you will not be bothered by other people's words. It will not personally upset you or offend you. Okay, and Garrett says, I have aphantasia, meaning I cannot visualize. Great. Fantastic. That is a gigantic support to your meditation practice. Being unable to visualize, great. That is one less source of distraction when you're trying to meditate. Great. I'm happy for you. That's actually a very good thing. He says, the only time I've had a mental image is a few nimittas during meditation. Ignore them. God, people just get way too obsessed. Like they have some hallucination during meditation and they think they have some deep attainment of samadhi. 99.9% of the time, visual nimittas during meditation are a bad thing, not a good thing. Ignore them. Continue your meditation practice. Do not pay any attention to random images appearing in your mind. It's just meaningless noise at best and harmful distractions at worst. So don't pay any attention. Just keep doing your meditation practice. Garrett continues, a friend calls this a past life attainment. What do you think? I think your friend is wrong. Is it occurring as the result of something that happened in your past life? I mean, yeah, maybe, but so? It's nothing good. At best, it's just something neutral. So random mental images during meditation, again, it's just meaningless most of the time. It's almost always just a pointless distraction. So is it coming from past lives? Yeah, maybe, but so? Don't pay any attention to these images. Karuna says, they're also sometimes taught as application of thought plus sustaining of thought, or aiming and rubbing. Well, aiming and rubbing, that's a new one. Haven't heard that before. And also as an instruction to first jhana, not a drawback. Is this far off from the sutta usage? Yes. That has nothing to do with what's in the suttas. Those translations are actually translations from the commentaries. So the commentary invented its own definition for the terms vitaka and vichara when used specifically in the context of jhana. but there is no basis for this in the suttas. It's just another example of the wild fantasies of the commentator. So in the suttas, Vitakka and Vichara are described as the defects of first jhana. They are not described as ways of attaining first jhana. They're described as things which need to be let go of in order for one's samadhi to grow deeper. They're never described as something to be deliberately cultivated. They're described as something to be deliberately discarded and let go of. So the commentaries went off in some total wild tangent of defining these terms completely differently from how they're used in the suttas. Nonetheless, some people do find the commentarial ideas useful, but it's good to keep in mind that they just don't have anything to do with what it says in the suttas. Okay, so then Tannik says, does renunciation mean I have to give up all my interests and hobbies? Not necessarily. I mean, it depends on what you want to do with your life. So if your interest is in studying the suttas and practicing meditation, learning Pali, doing chanting, memorizing suttas, listening to Dhamma talks, those are all very useful interests and hobbies. You don't need to give up any of that. If your interest and hobbies are things like charity work, acts of generosity and kindness, again, those are great hobbies. You don't have to give those up either. So what you have to renounce is anything which fuels greed, hatred, and delusion. That's what you have to renounce. Again, renunciation practice doesn't necessarily mean becoming a monk. You can also practice some degree of renunciation as a lay person. And the amount of renunciation you practice is up to you. So don't push yourself too hard, but also don't be too lazy. Dempson is saying, the quail simile, held too loosely it could escape, but held too tightly it might be crushed. Learning how and when to make effort or to let go. Yeah, it's a constant investigation. If you tense up too much, if you're really bearing down too much, then you can get agitated. Whereas if you're too relaxed, then the mind gets dull and spacey. So you want to hold the mind at the proper level of effort, where the mind is alert and steady, but neither agitated nor dull. That's what that quail simile is talking about. And Mur asks, what is a sutta? A sutta is a recorded teaching of the Buddha, which theoretically was memorized by the Buddha's immediate disciples and then passed down as an oral tradition for hundreds of years before eventually being written down into book form about 2,000 years ago. And Mary first typed in a string of 9s and then said, sorry about the above, my cat was sitting on the computer keyboard. I understand. So the monastery cat who's here, at one point he actually unplugged the computer during the live stream, which then led to the live stream cutting off early. So I understand the challenges of cats and technology. So Colin says, you mentioned a lifestyle conducive to samadhi. Would you say that in general, there's a huge advantage for practice by living in a tranquil monastery versus a hectic layperson's life? Yeah, absolutely. That's why we have monasteries. That's why monasteries exist. And Kumu says, Sotapanna Magga and Sotapanna Phala are how they are translated in some books. So you think stream entry and stream winning might be referring to Sotapati Magga and Sotapati Phala. It's possible that's what he meant. but it's again, you'd have to ask that particular monk what he meant. Either way, it's kind of irrelevant, because either way, the practice is the same. It's not different. Yeah, Sud clarifies. He was referring to Magga versus Pala. What is the difference between Magga and Pala? So it's actually never clearly defined in the suttas, the difference. So Magga is someone who is on the path to stream entry. So they've cultivated the necessary requisites to become a stream enterer. They just haven't quite made it all the way there yet. Whereas Pala is referring to the moment when they break through and they actually become a stream enterer. So there's debates about what this means. It's never clearly distinguished in the suttas, except that again, someone who's on the path is someone who's not yet a stream enterer, but who will definitely become one in this life. In the commentaries, they claim that this lasts for exactly one instant, one mind moment, so a tiny fraction of a second. But that seems improbable, because in the suttas, it seems to talk about it as a person who actually has some ongoing existence for a while. So it seems to indicate that a person who's attained the path to stream entry, again, they're not yet a stream enterer, but they might be in that not yet state for quite some time before eventually attaining full awakening. Possibly not until the moment of death. Until they attain the first stage of awakening. Jefferson says, Ekaggata is a thing for first jhana. I think yes, but sometimes in the suttas, only second jhana and forward have Ekaggata described. Oh, I have to look it up. I don't remember off the top of my head. So the most common place this is found is in the Anupada Sutta. Let me briefly check the Anupada Sutta. So the Anupada Sutta is from the Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 111, in which Venerable Sariputta is describing what he sees as the characteristics of each of the jhana states. And yes, he does have Ekaggata as being present even in the first jhana. So Ekaggata means unification. So coming together into one. So unification of mind. So yeah, the mind can be unified while still wavering a little bit. So Ekaggata I don't see as being in contradiction. So again, Ekaggata is something which is present even in first jhana when there's still Vitakka and Vichara. So the mind is still wavering a little bit, but it's unified. It's not moving from its meditation object, but it can wander a little bit. So in the sense that, for example, right now I'm looking at the camera, but I can wobble a little bit without losing my gaze on the camera. So in the same way, the mind can be unified, but still be wobbling a little bit. And Tannik says, to get into jhana, I just need to relax and keep awareness of breath. That's a start. That's a start. But no, I don't think that's sufficient. Entering into jhana requires razor sharp mindfulness, coupled with steady stillness, a mind which is completely free of the 5 hindrances. So if you can do that just through awareness of breath, then that's great. But just being aware of the breath while being relaxed is not necessarily going to be sufficient. There is a certain effort which is necessary to keep the mind sharp and alert and precise in its knowing, which is necessary to make progress in samadhi. Okay, then Jason says, what is the Pali word for intoxicant in the 5th precept? Is it referring specifically to physical substances? So many things can be intoxicating nowadays, like media. So yes, it is referring specifically to physical substances. So Sira Mereya Majjapamadhatana. So alcohol, liquor, and intoxicants which cause heedlessness. So I would say yes, that's talking about physical substances. So any physical thing which, when ingested, causes heedlessness or negligence. I do agree that there are lots of forms of entertainment which are intoxicating in their own way, but that fits under the seventh precept. So the seventh precept is about refraining from entertainment, music and shows and so on. So not part of the standard 5 lay precepts, but rather part of the renunciant precepts that are usually followed by monastics and people staying in monasteries. And Sut says, how far can one go on the path without ever attaining jhanas per sutta teachings? Well, this is actually another point of debate. So in the suttas, it never actually clearly specifies if one needs jhana in order to become a stream enterer. So I personally think probably not, actually. I think it might not be necessary. But jhana does seem to be necessary to attain full awakening. So definitely the final stage, it seems to be necessary. There can be some debate around the second and third stages of awakening. I'm inclined to think for the third stage also, jhana is necessary. Yeah, that's what my thoughts are on the matter. Asenta says, is the causing heedlessness always used when referring to not taking alcohol? Not always. There's a few places where the Buddha just speaks simply about refraining from alcohol. But normally it's used as this phrase, Sara Mereya Majjapamadhatana. But there's a few places where it just refers to the alcohol part and it doesn't specify the intoxication part. And Colin says, I'm relatively new to deepening my practice in reading the suttas. Some teachers strongly promote the Abhidhamma, whereas others reject. So confusing. What are your thoughts on this, please? Well, my thoughts are that if you want to know what the Buddha taught, then you should read the suttas. And even if you want to study Abhidhamma, remember that in theory, the Abhidhamma is a condensation and collection of material from the suttas. So even if you want to later on study the Abhidhamma, it will be very beneficial if you have already read the suttas. The Abhidhamma will make a lot more sense if you've already read the suttas. Much easier to understand. So in my opinion, whatever it is you want to study, always start by reading the suttas, because that will give you a solid foundation for understanding anything else in the Buddhist world that you then go into. So I personally am not a big fan of the Abhidhamma. It's also important to keep in mind, by the way, that most of the time when people talk about studying Abhidhamma, they're not talking about the Abhidhamma Pitaka. Usually, they're talking about studying medieval commentaries written in Burma and Sri Lanka, usually starting around the 12th century. So there was a very influential book written in the 12th century called the Abhidhammatta Sangaha, which then came to be the basis of virtually all Abhidhamma studies in the past 800 years. But that book is radically different from the Abhidhamma Pitaka. It's only superficially similar. And similarly, the studies of Abhidhamma, which have happened based upon that book, often vary quite dramatically from what we actually see in the Abhidhamma Pitaka, let alone what we see in the Sutta Pitaka. So again, if you really want to study Abhidhamma, I'd recommend doing it in this order. First, read the Sutta Pitaka, all of it. Next, read the Abhidhamma Pitaka, all of it. Then, if you're still interested, then you can read the medieval Abhidhamma commentaries. So starting in the 6th century AD and then going to the 12th century AD when the Abhidhamma Sangaha was written. Then you'll have a pretty clear sense as to how things shifted and developed in the 1500 years or so after the Buddha's passing. Then if you want to, you can start reading more contemporary Abhidhamma commentaries. And again, what you'll get a sense as you read through all of this is how starting from relatively simple, clear, and straightforward teachings from the suttas, things evolved in a quite strange and far out direction, which wanders quite dramatically from the Buddha's original teachings. So it's not necessarily that the contemporary Abhidhamma commentaries are bad per se. It's just that it's quite different from what you'll read in the suttas. Asanta says, I asked to see if it is the getting intoxicated, not the drinking alcohol, that is the thing to avoid. Sorry, bad news. It's the alcohol that's to be avoided. This is such a common excuse that people try to do. They're like, oh, I don't get intoxicated as long as I only have one drink, or maybe 2 drinks, and also some weed, and a little bit of LSD. Oh, I'm not intoxicated. It's like, of course you're not. How about just 0? How about none at all? Don't take risks with your mind. Your mindfulness and wisdom are the most precious things you have. Don't compromise them. So if you're content with only having 1 drink, well, how about only half a drink? And if you're content with only half a drink, how about no drinks? And if you really so desperately think you need to have a drink of alcohol, maybe you need to look at that attachment you've got going on there. Look at why your attachment to alcohol is more important to you than your faith in the Buddha's teachings. So Jojo says, I have a unique situation at my job. I create a drawing, someone checks it, and someone approves it. I'm asked that I date everything the same day, regardless of if it happens that way or not. Is this bad? I'm not sure when everything gets approved. Should I bring this up to my boss? Is it lying? I mean, it says, to be clear, I'm not sure when everything is approved. Is it bad to date everything like this anyway? It does seem to fit in the category of lying. Of course, part of me is like, why do they need to have all these dates on things anyway? Like, what's the big deal? It just seems like a bunch of unnecessary administrative nonsense of like sticking dates on the drawings and the approvals and the certifications and then this and then that. Like, what's this need to have all these dates on everything? Like, what's the point? So I also understand why some people would just kind of gloss over it and being like, well, the date is really unnecessary and pointless and meaningless. So I would also be inclined to kind of look into it and see like, what is actually the significance of the dates on all of these things? Is it actually have any relevance or bearing? Or is it just some administrative nonsense where you need to write something so they write the same date for everything just because it makes everything cleaner and simpler? So again, it's different. Like if you're selling milk, for example, then the dates are actually important because if you put the wrong dates, then people get rotten food and they can get sick. On the other hand, when it's like, well, there's the date on the drawing and the date on the approval and the date on the checking and the date on when the boss reads about it and the date on the blah, blah, blah. Well, why? Is somebody going to like get food poisoning if there's the wrong date on your drawing? Probably not. So again, it's like, why is this even here? So And is it technically lying? I think, yeah, it probably is technically lying. If you did the drawing on the 10th, but you wrote that you did it on the 12th, that is technically lying. So if you're feeling uncomfortable about it, I would just tell your boss. Tell your boss, oh, I have a strict religious rule about not telling lies, so I can't put the wrong date on things. What you might do is ask your boss if you can just leave the date section blank, and your boss can put in whatever date your boss wants to put there. That would be a way of shifting the responsibility. Or ask your boss if you can actually just put the real date on things. Like, what's the big deal? Seriously. But yeah, this all just sounds like a bunch of corporate papancha. Like, why do people do these things to themselves? I really don't understand. Life doesn't need to be so complicated. Tannik says, how to cultivate razor sharp mindfulness. I'm forgetful in everyday life. You're forgetful because you're not practicing mindfulness. So mindfulness, pay clear, sharp, detailed attention to body sensation at all times. Constantly be sharply, clearly aware of your body. That's the most important thing. And Colin says, it's interesting that my body rejects alcohol. Also, I grew up in a family and society strongly conditioned not to consume alcohol and drugs. Good karma, perhaps. Yeah, it sounds like the result of good karma. Yeah. Jefferson says, in the suttas, only suttas, Lord Buddha says that kasina is a way to nibbana, like Anapanasati. Actually, kasinas are hardly ever mentioned in the entire Sutta Pitaka. They're only mentioned in a tiny handful of places, and they're never explained. So I personally am quite skeptical about the inclusion of kasinas when we talk about Buddhist meditation. Again, they're almost like a footnote that somehow made their way into the text. Like the Buddha hardly ever even mentions them and doesn't describe them at all or explain them at all. So anytime somebody is talking about kasina meditation, they're talking about something that was produced sometime after the Buddha. So I would be very cautious when approaching kasina meditation. Jojo says, I think I might be overly analyzing my precepts and stressing too often. Is it good that I'm that particular about not breaking precepts? Generally speaking, it is better to be particular about not breaking precepts. It's better to be too strict with your precepts than too loose. Especially in the beginning when you're really trying to understand the precepts, it's better to be more strict. And as you get a better understanding of how the precepts work, then you'll also understand when you can be a little more flexible without actually breaking the precepts. But in the beginning, it's better to be on the too strict side. And Jojo says, I actually didn't put the date down today and no one cared. Well, now you have your solution. Just don't put the date down. If you think the date is lying, then just don't write the date. And this person, I can't read, it looks like Greek letters your name is written in. I can't read Greek letters, I'm sorry. So they say, what do you know about the Dhammakaya tradition of Thailand? They're a temple near me. They have unique beliefs which are completely different from every other form of Buddhism. If you want to learn more, do a Google search. But yeah, they're completely different from every other form of Buddhism. Only on the surface does it look like Buddhism. Demsen asks, can a society establish a judicial court based on Buddhist laws and conducts? Is this allowed? Not really. Not really, because one of the Buddhist principles is not to imprison or cause others to be imprisoned, not to harm or cause others to be harmed, not to kill or cause others to be killed. So it would be very difficult to have a functioning judicial system, I don't know how you would handle criminals. So you'd have to come up with some kind of non-punitive way of reforming criminals. And that would actually be ideal. But the current judicial systems we have are not Buddhist. They wouldn't function at all. So you'd have to come up with some kind of non-punitive reform for criminals, which I'm in favor of. I think it's a great idea. Something that doesn't involve imprisoning or harming people. Tannik says, if I'm paying attention to my body, how do I keep all my plans and stuff in my mind? Well, first off, you probably don't need to keep most of that stuff on your mind. Second, as you maintain mindfulness of the body, you'll start to realize that you actually are capable of maintaining mindfulness of the body while also doing minimal mental activity from time to time. But most of the time, you actually don't need to do any mental activity. You can just maintain mindfulness of the body. Wow, the questions just keep coming today. That's great. Sud says, how can metta help progress in terms of eliminating the fetters on the path? Well, the most obvious is that metta counteracts aversion. So it reduces hatred, aversion, negativity in the mind, which then makes it easier to develop concentration. And then with a lack of aversion and with strong concentration, one can also recognize one's greed tendencies. Also with good metta, then one will also have contentment, so their greed will also be weakened. So through diminishing greed and hatred, through cultivating concentration, then one has the conditions for developing insight. So the clarity and stability of mind in order to cultivate wisdom. So that's how. Mira says, how can one maintain their practice in their daily life? Through practicing kindness, patience, equanimity, and constant mindfulness of the body. Rabi asks, is the Vinaya punitive? No. Also, the Vinaya is only relevant to monks. Like if you're not a bhikkhu or a bhikkhuni or someone planning to become one, then the Vinaya doesn't have anything to do with you. So don't worry about it. For those of us who are bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, then the Vinaya is a guide for self-reflection, for self-investigation, and to help us understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, and to train the mind in order to better live in accordance with Dhamma. But the exact workings and details of that are for monks, not for lay people. It's generally discouraged for lay people to study Vinaya because Vinaya is a lifelong study, requires hundreds and hundreds of hours of deep, in-depth study to even begin to understand it. And unless you are actually living the monastic life, you will never really understand the Vinaya. It's something which is experiential. Just reading a couple books about Vinaya, you won't have any clue what Vinaya is. It's something which has to be lived in order to be understood. But no, it is not punitive. Not at all. And Colin says, may I ask what made you go forth to ordain? It's because I wanted to attain full enlightenment. That's why. I want to be an arhat. That's why. Why else? Says, was it Nibbida and Samvega? Yeah, there's that. Perhaps there's already a recorded talk to answer the most common question, why did you become a monk? I have answered this question so many times. Almost every day someone asks this question. So yes, I suspect there are actually numerous recorded talks where I've answered this question. Tannik says, if I have an overbearing and micro-controlling family member, it's good for me to train my kanti and letting go of my ego, but I find it increases my aversion. Any advice? Yes, practice metta. Do lots and lots of metta, and also do acts of kindness and generosity for that relative. And also view them as someone who's chronically sick. So their harmful behaviors are a product of spiritual sickness, namely a lack of sufficient wisdom. So see them as someone who's chronically ill. So when you're around someone who has, for example, a mental illness, and that person says or does things which are normally offensive, well, it doesn't offend you because you know, oh, this person is just mentally ill. So in the same way, see your family member is suffering from spiritual illness, which means they don't understand the proper ways of acting and speaking. So have compassion for them. Don't be bothered by the symptoms of their illness. Just wish for them to get well. Mir says, what are the expectations of lay people, or better yet, what discipline should lay people follow? Follow the 5 precepts. Do meditation every day. Practice generosity. Practice kindness. That's what I recommend. Study the suttas. Yeah, read suttas for at least a few minutes every day. And V.L. Hari Naidu says, what do you understand by time? Oh boy. It's something which is mostly irrelevant because we only ever live in the present moment anyway. Past and future are just delusions of the mind. They're not real. And Karuna says, and the Honeyball Sutta, so that's Madhupindika Sutta, says where it said, what you feel, you perceive, what you perceive, you think about, what you think about, you proliferate. But can't we choose what we think about, even if we can't choose what we feel? Yes. So the point there is to be aware of the feeling and then not to start producing deliberate mental activity based on those feelings. And if you do notice you're engaging in deliberate mental activity, don't complexify it. So don't papanchify your thoughts. If you notice you're thinking, stop there. Don't make it more complicated. Don't build it up. Don't papanchify it. Robbie says, why shouldn't lay people concern themselves with the Vinaya? I think I explained that already. Unless you're actually planning to become a monk, it's really irrelevant to you. And as I mentioned before, you're not going to understand it anyway. It's not something which can be understood with any less than hundreds of hours of study and actually living the life for a few years. So it's just not really relevant for lay people. And usually what I found is lay people who study Vinaya, they wind up dramatically misunderstanding it, and then becoming judgmental and critical, unnecessarily judgmental and incorrectly critical of Buddhist monks. So it's really not recommended. And this isn't my own advice. This is standard advice in Buddhist tradition. It's really not recommended to study Vinaya unless you're either a monk or planning to become a monk. Jojo says, if we have someone who is addicted to drugs in our life, how can we help them quit? Contact addiction treatment centers and ask them for advice. Those organizations exist for a reason. They exist for helping people break their addictions and also helping the friends and family of people with addictions. So I don't work in addiction treatment, so I'm not the best person to ask. Gregory says, as part of my job, I am told not to divulge certain information to my workers. How do I answer their questions without breaking the precepts? Well, that's challenging at times. Often it's a matter of redirecting the conversation or telling them the information that they need to know, but not the information they don't need to know. Or sometimes you actually just need to directly tell someone, like, there's limits about what I'm allowed to divulge. But it's very circumstantial, so I can't really give clear guidance on this one. But yeah, don't lie. That's the number one. Don't lie. Mir says, through meditation, is there an expectation to connect with our past lives? Would this grant a better understanding of our current life? It is not an expectation. It does happen to a small number of people. A small number of people do start to remember their past lives, but not most people. For some people, it is helpful. For other people, it's also not really helpful. It's just kind of irrelevant. So I recommend not worrying about your past lives. Instead, focus on what you're doing with your present life. Gregory says, don't lay people need to know the Vinaya to evaluate if monks are worthy of support? No, you need to know the Dhamma. So a good monk is one who lives in accordance with Dhamma. And if a monk is living in accordance with Dhamma, then they will also be living in accordance with much of the Vinaya, but not necessarily all of the Vinaya. This is also what makes Vinaya studies complicated, is that Vinaya does not overlap 100% with Dhamma. And it is the Dhamma that leads to liberation, not the Vinaya. So there are monks who are exceptionally good Dhamma practitioners, but not exceptionally good Vinaya practitioners. So they won't break the really major things because the really major things are all principles of Dhamma. But they might not be following the more minor Vinaya rules, the ones which don't have anything to do with Dhamma. So it is not good to judge monks based upon their Vinaya practice. That's for each monk to figure out for themselves. Rather, judge them by their Dhamma practice. Are they practicing kindness? Are they practicing self-restraint? Are they practicing renunciation? Are they practicing compassion? Are they cultivating wisdom? Judge them by Dhamma practice. And that you learn through studying the suttas. This is what's really important. And Moriah says, do you think it's reasonable that lay people with a family at home try to keep the 8 precepts for life? This seems very hard when taking care of children. I think it's not very reasonable, to be honest. I think following the 5 precepts is quite reasonable for lay people with family and children. Following the 8 precepts, theoretically possible, but it's going to be quite challenging. So it's usually recommended for lay people to follow the 8 precepts from time to time for short periods of time, but not as a lifetime commitment. And after you've done it periodically for short periods of time, if it really seems to work out for you, then you can try doing longer term commitments. But it's really not expected. Sometimes lay people who do not have children and don't have complicated family situations, sometimes they're able to keep 8 precepts for long periods of time or even a lifetime. And if that's your case, then yeah, if you really think you can make it work with your life, then it is a good thing to do. The 8 precepts are very supportive to one's practice. But if it really doesn't fit with your family life, then don't try to force it. Just do the 8 precepts once in a while, for a few days here and there. And VL Hari Naidu says, time is directly related to sensations happening in the brain-body system. Do you agree? No, I don't. So Jefferson says, I think in one sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, the monk Chitta uses superpowers in front of a layperson because the layperson asks for him to do to increase faith is not wrong. If you could send the sutta reference, I don't remember off the top of my head. I don't remember this particular sutta. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to look at the sutta to be sure. So actually, if you send it to the monastery email address, then maybe we'll talk about that sutta in one of the upcoming sutta study sessions. So Jefferson, if you can email the monastery email address with the sutta that you're referring to, then we'll talk about it sometime soon. And that's the last question online. So it looks like we're wrapping up for the evening. So thank you all for your wonderful questions. And we'll end now with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.